So, hi, I'm Regina. I am the digital security coordinator at an NGO based in Berlin, where I provide internal digital security support. I create learning resources for activists, journalists, human rights defenders, and members of civil society, as well as providing advice and workshops to other organizations. This means I get to think about fun things like APTs, organized crime, disorganized crime, hate groups, abusive family members and intimate partners, and bad luck in the context of no or minimal funding, lack of dedicated security or technical support, low-end, old, or second-hand equipment, and exceptional baseline levels of stress, all of which makes effectively targeting security behaviors that much more important. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about things to consider when trying to get people around you to learn new security practices. My background on this comes mainly from coursework in public health, years of running trainings, and then lots and lots of time around much more conventionally trained teachers. Then I'm going to look at how some of the skills and techniques commonly used in social engineering can be helpful or how they can be distinctly unhelpful. My background in that comes from my activism, my work, and some other stuff. So when I think about teaching, I think about it as creating this experience that is both engaging emotional and rational aspects, and it moves people from one point to another. And there are a lot of different things that can affect a given learning experience, like the topic being covered, the materials being used to support the educational intervention, the skill of the teacher, how distracted the learner is, how distracted the teacher is, the cultural background and personalities of both the teacher and the learner, and then lots and lots of other things. And so this applies when you're doing like more formal trainings, but it also matters when you're just like sitting down with a colleague one-on-one. So, when I start thinking about getting ready to teach something, I generally start by asking myself to what ends, meaning what is my goal for the learner? And generally I find that tends to fall into one of three categories. So, I have teaching for facts, which is about specific pieces of information, and it's often referred to as rote learning or memorization. There is teaching for understanding, which is much more about learning a way of thinking or a framework of analysis. And then, third, I have actions, and this is basically behavior modification. So this means not only conveying information about how to do something, but creating a space that builds the self-efficacy for people to be able to put that information into practice. And this is my favorite because when done correctly, it's basically about supporting people on fixing and improving their own stuff. So figuring out which one of these three things I'm aiming for helps me figure out what might be appropriate approaches, but then it also helps me figure out how I'm going to evaluate how well things went at the end. So increasing a learner's self-efficacy greatly reduces how much effort I have to put in to get them to actually change what they're doing. And what self-efficacy is it's just the belief that you can actually do a specific thing. And it features really prominently in a lot of public health interventions, especially related to addiction. And the idea originally comes from a psychologist named Alfred Bandura, and it's basically the idea that you're in a better starting point for changing what you're doing if you believe that you can change what you're doing, rather than if you believe that it's impossible for you. So Bandura also came up with this nifty idea called social learning theory, which is the acknowledgement that you can learn things through indirect social observation, which is sadly way more applicable for bad habits than good habits, so I don't recommend relying on that. Social learning theory is an idea about how people learn, but there are also theories about how to teach to best facilitate learning. Some approaches are geared towards specific populations, and some towards specific topics. I've put a few examples up here, and I encourage you to look into them deeper, though we don't have time in this talk. But like almost all of that there can be summarized as basically ask questions, borrow from other fields, get learners engaged, and then like be aware of social dynamics. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into Malcolm Knowles and his work, which is commonly known as adult learning theory, though there are a lot of other theories about how adults learn. Adult learning theory has criteria for who counts as an adult learner, it has guidance on the general ideas to promote learning by adults, and it's tied to the ADIDS content structure. My major critique of adult learning theory is that it assumes that adults learn differently than children, and I think it's really just that we have accepted that we can't bully within learning adults the way that we try to within kids. And so I would hope that if you're working with teenagers or even younger kids, you might also think about some of these ideas. So ADIDS stands for activity, discussion, input, deepening, and synthesis. And I use this structure pretty extensively when I'm drafting curricula and self-learning interventions. But I tend not to follow it super to the T, but it's just a good checklist for myself to make sure that I'm putting things together in an order that is supportive to the learner. So with the activity, it is something interactive that draws on the learner's lived experience and primes them for integrating what you want to teach them into existing mental models and frameworks. The discussion is a chance to get everyone on the same page and to add in any key points that you want people to start thinking about that didn't come up organically in the activity. The input is the more conventional learning, teaching, standing up there, doing something like this part. And then the deepening is a chance for the learner to try to integrate and experiment with the new information from the input and kind of deepen their understanding. Synthesis at the end is just a chance to wrap up any loose ends, provide a summary, and just catch any stray questions. So functionally what this means is I start with something interactive, I have a chance to talk about what that activity raised, I move on to direct instruction, apply that learning hands-on, and then I give another chance for questions and reflections. This is because just talking to people is not necessarily that effective all of the time. Though I'm really glad you're all here. So if I were doing this talk as a workshop, it might look something like starting with a popcorn session where you talk about good and bad learning experiences that you've had. And then we might go on to talking in a group about the different characteristics of the things that you brought up as good or bad. At which point I would introduce adult learning theory and ADIDS. And then we could move into a small group work, which could be brainstorming or trying to apply what you just learned to the topics you generally teach people about. And then we would come back together, you could share what you noticed, ask some more questions, and maybe do a little bit more of a presentation of what you did in the small groups. If I had enough time, I might even include a second go-around that had more of a focus on planning and implementation, like making a full curriculum, and then troubleshooting issues that might come up, like if this is a really new approach for you, or if this would be a really new approach for where you're working, or trying to do the educational intervention. So notably, only one of these 5 steps is actually someone standing up here talking. And that's because the activity and this discussion get people ready and open to the topic. The input is the new information, and the deepening and synthesis are about making sure that the new information gets cemented in by connecting it to what they already know. This is basically about getting people into the emotional and mental state that they need to be in order to work with and really integrate new information. Another nice thing about ADIDS is it makes it a little bit harder for you to move through info way more quickly than people are likely to be able to absorb. So when your goal is behavior change, addressing self-efficacy can include troubleshooting real and perceived barriers. Sometimes it can be about helping set realistic expectations, and sometimes it's just about encouragement. So it's worth thinking about how you might be able to do that in a way that's specifically relevant to whoever you're working with. So if someone says something is hard, just believe them. They are experiencing it as hard, and insisting that they are wrong isn't going to change how they're currently experiencing it, but it may make them not want to bring problems to you in the future. I also really like to frame things in a way that kind of validates the experience of challenge or difficulty while setting future expectations at a more reasonable level. So this is things like, okay, yes, it's hard now, but it gets easier. It's going to be easier. And another good thing about this is, as long as it is something that will actually get easier, if it continues to be incredibly hard, you maybe want them to come to you because it may mean that 1, they're doing it wrong, or 2, that they just need a different solution. So ADIDS is a great guide for planning, but it's just a framework to help you create a controlled emotional experience, and there are a lot of other skills that are also needed, like asking questions to guide a discussion or prompt a learner to try a different approach, and using active listening, reading expressions, sensing how much you can get away with pushing someone's impatience and the ability to gauge them, and then present in a way that is comfortable to the other person. All of that is important for shaping an effective learning experience. And they're also all skills that are frequently used in social engineering. There's also a ton of acting skills that is kind of about holding people's attention or presenting to a room or just like broadcasting your voice that are really helpful with both. So scaring people into better security really doesn't work, I promise you. But creating and addressing fear can be extremely powerful tools in predisposing people to specific actions. So we know that creating fear and stress can massively increase the effectiveness of phishing attacks and other kinds of social engineering. An appealing solution to manufactured fear can also be used, like when you have a pop-up that simultaneously tells you there's a virus, and if you just click here and install this thing, it will fix it. But fear can also create paralysis, and the association of a topic with fear can lead to avoidance. Most of us have probably experienced this, most likely with a topic related to money or health. So in public health, there's a lot that goes into trying to figure out how to both acknowledge the seriousness or gravity of a situation, while also pushing as few emotional buttons as possible. And so this is stuff like maintaining a calm demeanor and warning before you're going to say something scary instead of it being like, and then immediately providing context to help people understand the risk, as well as talking about mitigation options. So with social engineering, that paralysis is often really useful. But when you're looking at education, sometimes just reaching that level of heightened emotional state is enough to kind of dissuade someone from ever wanting to revisit the topic, and just leads people to avoid thinking about it instead of having any kind of motivating effect for them to take proactive action. So establishing trust is important when teaching, and especially when you're talking about a topic like security, where people are fairly unlikely to have the internal knowledge already to be able to tell if what you're saying actually is true. So while sometimes similar, rapport building is not the same as establishing trust. Rapport is about feeling connected, but you can feel super in sync with someone and know that they will still let you down. It's good for getting favors, but security should not be a favor. You can use a bunch of techniques like mirroring and obligation to get rapport fairly quickly, but it also breaks quickly. Trust is better thought of as slow and hopefully persistent. So with social engineering, the goal is generally short-term, with the expectation that you don't need the glamour to last much past the end of the interaction, or the con, for lack of a better term. But with teaching, our hope is that the lessons and behaviors are going to be retained indefinitely. If social engineering is about getting someone to do a thing, then teaching for behavior change is about helping someone figure out how to socially engineer themselves. It's one thing for me to get my colleague to use a password manager to generate super strong passwords when I'm standing right there. It's another thing for me to get that colleague to a point where they're going to do that even when I am not looking over their shoulder. So rapport is sometimes more important than trust, especially for those of us who are not people, and rapport building techniques can be incredibly useful. I'm not against it. Even with looking at the differences between trust and rapport, you can kind of see how you could sort of substitute one for the other sometimes. However, potentially more important than all of these kinds of mismatches, attempting to use certain social engineering techniques with your colleagues causes two kind of fatal problems that aren't really just that it's the wrong tool for the situation. So, problem one. With some of your colleagues, you are normalizing manipulative behaviors in connection to digital security. You are training them to be vulnerable, especially to the kinds of attacks that are not going to be as easily stopped with better visibility endpoint solutions or a higher level of lockdown. When we tell people to ignore scarily worded messages without explaining them, or when we ask people to share passwords, especially over the phone or over email, it kind of puts the idea that, like, that's okay stuff. Plus, if you're mean while doing it, you are doubly setting up your coworkers for an attacker to be able to come in and pretend to rescue them. So, just because they're going to be so happy to maybe get some help without being made to feel awful about it. Like, all of us have bad days. We all have our mean days, and I'm not saying that if you're ever short with a colleague, you are responsible for every phishing attack that ever happens where you work, but do kind of think about the impact of how you choose to engage with the people around you and whether or not that's actually what you want it to be. So problem 2 is that some of your colleagues are bound to be a bit more resistant to manipulation. And with some of them, you're just going to fall a little bit short and you will fail, and that's fine, if disappointing to you. But with others, you're going to set off the same twinge that an attacker would. So they're going to consciously or unconsciously sort you into the bad actor bucket, and that's not a good thing. Like, sometimes it means that they just will be a bit wary of you, but sometimes it means that they're going to actively hate you for insulting their intelligence and thinking that you could pull a fast one on them, and it can also feel super disrespectful. So in that situation, you've not only made enemies of a colleague by doing this, but you've specifically aligned against you the people who you should be most able to get to work with you and to, like, come to you with problems that they're noticing earlier, because they're just a little bit more aware of it. And this can also feed into shadow IT, because if people don't trust you, especially when it's on a gut level, they're more likely to go out of their way to avoid interacting with you. And that means that they would rather go through the process of setting up an alternative system than trying to get support from someone they perceive as unsupportive or worse. So you can affect habits through directly targeting behaviors or indirectly through affecting attitudes and understanding. Habits are also seldom contained to just one area of a person's life. This is true with the bad habits people bring in from, like, an old job or from their personal life, and it shows up in the office and then you have to deal with it. But it's also just as true going in the other direction in terms of thinking about, like, the impact that what you do in terms of security education where you work has on their personal lives. So what you do, the impression you make when you're doing security education interventions, that carries over into people's future workplaces and their homes. And that's actually a serious responsibility, but it's also a pretty amazing opportunity. So I hope this talk was helpful, or at least a little interesting. Teaching, whether formal or informal, is hard, but there are tools to make it a little bit easier. And if you're trying to get someone to do something when you're not there, just be aware and, like, try to specifically aim for the things that are going to facilitate that. You may already have a bunch of the skills that you need to be great at teaching, but take some time to reflect, to make sure that, like, you're doing things that are going to lead to a better outcome and not things that are going to get in your way of being effective. And when you teach about digital security in your work, that is a responsibility and an opportunity, and the people you work with deserve good security in all parts of their lives, because everyone does. And this is both about your responsibility to other people, individually, but also to, like, the larger society. So thanks. So I think there's time for questions. If anyone has them, though that was the 20 minutes, I believe. All right, come find me later if there's anything you want to ask privately.